Hey guys, welcome. Another video on music production today. I'm Dr. D, Dr. D Productions, and today we're going to be talking about Pro Tools and kind of going over the basics of routing and session setup. We're going to use and create some tracks. We're going to use the grouping technique for editing purposes. So groups of instruments that you can edit simultaneously, as well as setting up effects, returns, and sends. So we'll talk about how buses work within Pro Tools, how sends, effects, returns, and how to sum groups of instruments together. So track sums. So let's hop in. Here we go. So a lot of times when you open up Pro Tools, in your opening a session that was recorded on a different system with different inputs and different interfaces, you'll have this little error message that pops up that says, let you know that all these routing things have changed. No big deal. That's just kind of happens every time. So if you just click no and get that out of the way, we can hop into the session. There we go. Now you can see me. Sweet. So so what we got going on here is the edit window of Pro Tools, and we have a recording today that we did in one of my music classes at the college, and this was an acoustic singer-songwriter recording. So we put up several microphones in front of the acoustic guitar and the singer in front of the voice. So I'll kind of give you a breakdown. We've got a guitar DI track, which is coming off of the guitar's pickup. It's just a direct in from the guitar's pickup. Then we have a large diaphragm condenser, which I believe was positioned over the sound hole area of the acoustic guitar. There's a vocal track. This was an SM7B microphone, pretty close to the face of the singer, so hopefully not a lot of bleed going in from the guitar going into that mic. There's an overdub of some background voices. We set up a room mic, kind of a distant room mic. That was a blue Kiwi mic that was kind of sitting out front of the, like 10 feet away from the singer. And then there's a small diaphragm on the acoustic guitar. So I'm going to move that small diaphragm up here next to the large diaphragm guitar. So we had basically a stereo pair of mics on the guitar, small diaphragm on the 12th fret, large diaphragm on the sound hole to kind of get like a stereo low and high kind of part of the acoustic guitar. And then on top of all that, we had the stereo mic, the Sennheiser KM600 or something, I think it was. And it's just kind of like a stereo condenser mic that was like 3 feet in front of the singer, so it kind of picks up like like you're listening to the performance 4 feet in front of the singer. So it's kind of more of a perfect live front and center performance microphone capture of that. So that's what we got working to work with today, and let's talk about routing stuff. Okay, so first of all, I want to talk about this idea of creating groups. Okay, so for instance, we have 3 tracks here that are all for the guitar. One thing I might do with these 3 tracks is select them one at a time, holding down Command, and clicking on the nameplate of the track allows me to select or deselect individual tracks and kind of do that one at a time. Okay. Another trick for selecting multiple tracks is to use shift click. So shift click basically allows you to click between 2 points and it selects everything in between. So instead of individually clicking them one at a time, say I just want to click with the shift click, I hold down shift and I select the first one, then I hold down shift again. I don't need to hold down shift the first time, but I select the first thing, I hold down shift after that, and then I click on another track a little bit further away, and then it selects everything in between. So shift click and command click are ways of selecting multiple things. Sometimes this pops up. We don't need that right now, so bye. Cool. So we've got these 3 guitar tracks. Let's group them. To create a group, you select the 3 guitar tracks, and you can use Command G, or I think you can go up to track and find group. There it is. Yep. So it's under track, but this keyboard shortcut is Command G, way easier. Command G brings up the create a new track window, and basically whatever you've selected is inside of that group, and you can call it whatever you want. I'm going to call mine guitar. And then click OK. Cool. So what this does is over here in the bottom left, you have a groups window. And when things are selected, like say the guitar group, what that gives me is this functionality of globally editing or mixing, controlling faders or whatever, and soloing things. Basically, it globally affects all those tracks in that group when the group is selected. So if you don't want to edit everything all at once or whatever, you have to deselect that so you can go back to editing individually. There's all groups, so sometimes students are like, oh my gosh, my thing's selecting like every track at once and blah blah blah. It's like your all groups has been selected down here, so you got to deselect that so you can go back to individually doing things. So whatever group of instruments you might edit together, like a group of drum tracks or an orchestra of instruments that are, all recorded with live microphones, you can group those together so when you edit, you can edit everything simultaneously and, not worrying about selecting across a bunch of tracks and cutting and pasting and all that kind of stuff that can go wrong. Okay, cool. So I might, do that for the voices, create a group for the voices. I'm going to select both voice tracks, Command G. Here's my group window. I'm going to call it Vox, short for voice, I guess. It's my voice group. You can see the two voice tracks are in there, so we're good. Click OK. There's a voice track, a voice group. And now my voices are all kind of editable individually. And then I might do the same thing for my room mics. I'm going to create a room group. So select those two, Command G, room, group name. I just named it room, and then click OK. So if I need these or not, I created these as kind of a tool for editing. If I need to edit the room mics simultaneously because they both bleed into each other, I can do that. But most of the time I kind of leave it off until I need to do that. So that's for editing. Groups are for editing things globally. Like all the things in the group, you basically edit simultaneously. So it saves some time, also saves some, mistakes you might make of like moving something that's lined up with another track that was a live microphone during the recording session too, and all of a sudden everything sounds really funky because you moved two tracks that were basically capturing the same thing. Okay, cool. So the next thing I want to talk about is sums. So sum tracks, sum is kind of like short for summation, but basically if you take all the signals from one group of instruments, like all the acoustic guitar tracks, right? It's nice to be able to control all those acoustic guitar tracks with one fader. Right? And the way that you would do that is you would route those three signals into a new track, and you call that a sum track because it sums together those three guitars. And then I can control the guitars with one fader, or I can mess with them individually. So I have this complete control of like individual things, and then the whole thing as a group, as a sum, not a group to be confused, but the sum group. So this might happen in like a session where you have like 10 microphones on a drum set, right? And you want to route all the drums to one track so you can control the entire drum set volume up and down with one fader. And that's kind of handy when you're mixing. Once you balance all those individual things together and everything's perfect and the drums sound great by themselves, sometimes the whole drum set's just a little too loud and you can turn it up and down. Sometimes you might use a little EQ or compression on the entire drum set. You can do that on that sum track. So sum tracks are kind of for that purpose. So I'm going to switch over here into my mix window here. And what I'm going to do to create this, first of all, I'm going to show you the old school manual way so that you can kind of transparently see how this stuff works. So, for instance, what I'm going to use as a sum track. Sum tracks are primarily in Pro Tools world a stereo auxiliary input track. So, first of all, I might select the track right after my collection of guitars right there. I'm going to create a new track, so I can go up here and click new, or I can use Command Shift N. It's the keyboard shortcut for new track. Cool. I need to set a stereo. Very important. It's got to be stereo for some track. It's got to be stereo, and then an auxiliary input track. So a stereo auxiliary input track. I can also give it a name right here, and I'm going to call this the guitar sum. And I click create, and now there's a stereo auxiliary input track that is labeled guitar sum. So the way that we connect the signals and get the signals to go out of one group of tracks and into one singular track over here as a sum is I have to route them via a bus from the output of those 3 instrument tracks. Okay, so I'll show you over here. But basically, a bus is like an imaginary wire that connects the signal from one location to another location. Let me show you how to do that. So over here on my 3 guitar tracks, first of all, I'm going to make my 3 guitar tracks a different color so they're easier to see. Cool, they're green now. And I've selected all 3 of those guitar tracks, and now I'm going to hold down Option Shift to do this action to all 3 of these tracks at once. And I go to the output of the track. So right here under I/O, Inputs and Outputs, I'm going to select the output. It says monitor left and right. And I'm going to choose a bus from the bus category. I'm going to choose bus 1 and 2. It's got to be a stereo bus if it's going into a stereo auxiliary input track. So I select that, and now my outputs are set to be bus 1 and 2. All right, so that's that wire. But the wire's got to connect to something else. It's just a wire that's dangling now. So that wire needs to be connected to the input of my guitar sum, because that's where these signals are headed now. So over here where it says no input on my guitar sum, I go ahead and choose bus 1 and 2, and now the signal goes out of this bus, comes in through this bus, and then out through this track. Okay, so let's do that. I hit play, I can hear the music, cool. What if I soloed a track? Like I want to listen to the DI track by itself, and I hit play. I don't hear anything. I don't see any signal coming into my guitar sum track. Uh-oh, that's a problem. Because if I want to mix the guitar and I need to listen to that by itself and compress it and check it out individually and solo it, I can't hear anything. So what's going on here is when you solo a track, it mutes every other track, which works great if you don't have any routing going on like this. But the deal is I need to cancel out the solo button, the solo functionality of this guitar sum, because I want this guitar sum track to always be going. All my sum tracks I want to always be going no matter what, even when I solo. So what you do is called solo saving, and it's literally you just hold down the command key on a Mac or control key on a PC. You hold down command and you click on the S button of the guitar sum and it grays it out. So now I can hear the signal because it's bypassed that solo function of that sum track. Now the signal can travel into that sum and then out. Okay, cool. So that's creating a sum in the old-fashioned way where I manually set the buses and manually set it to the input of the next track and this and that. Another thing you could do back if you were doing it like this way, which no one does anymore, is you can rename these things. If you right-click on it and choose rename, you could call that bus like guitar bus or something. And now it says guitar bus instead of bus 1 and 2. So anyway, you can rename these things as well just by right-clicking and choosing rename. All right, so like I said, that's the old school way. Here's the more faster, efficient way, but less transparent. So similarly, I want to do the same thing on my vocal tracks. Okay, so I've got the 2 voice tracks selected, and what I want to do is the same thing. I want to create this stereo auxiliary input track. I want to route it with the buses to the input of that and blah, blah, blah. But I can do that much more efficiently this way. Okay, so here's how it works. You select those 2 tracks that you want to route into the sum track. I'm going to hold down Option Shift so I can do the same thing to both of them. I'm going to go to the furthest right of these 2 tracks because where it's going to put this next track is right next to wherever I clicked. So if I click here and all this, it's going to put it in between my 2 voice tracks. I want it to be on the right side. So I'm going to choose to do it from the right side of this group of collection of tracks. So I go to the output where it says monitor left and right, and instead of going to bus, I go down to where it says new track. Ooh. So if I click that, it's going to create a new track. It's a stereo auxiliary input track already, so I don't have to do all that. I can rename it real quickly right here. This is my Vox sum, and I just hit create, and boom, there's the Vox sum. And check it out, it's routed. It's got the output buses See that? It's Vox Sum, and then up here it goes to Vox Sum as the input for that track. So all those steps I did manually, it does it for you. But it's good to know that it happened manually, or how it happened, so that you kind of know how this whole thing works. But yeah, so that's much more quicker than the one we did the first time. So I might repeat that and do the same thing with my room mics, my stereo mic and my room mic. I'll call them the room sum or something like that. So same deal, select those two, Option Shift, I go to the output of the furthest right one because it's gonna throw the track next to it. I choose new track. There's my stereo auxiliary input track. I'm going to name it Room Sum. Hit OK, and boom, there it is. Okay, so same deal over here. Like if I hit play and I soloed the stereo mic or something, I don't hear anything. I got a solo safe. Some of the newer versions of Pro Tools I think automatically do this, or maybe there's a setting or something that I don't know about, but more or less this solo button needs to be grayed out. Do it with the command click on the solo button. Same deal with this Vox Sum. I need to do it there too, so I can hear the voice. Right, there we go. Cool, everything's coming out. Sweet, I hear all my mics coming out of the sums. So that is how you create sum tracks. And you would do this on any sort of musical recording context. You got a symphony, right? You got microphones in front of every section of the symphony. Maybe you group together the violins and then group together the brass, or group together the cellos, or whatever instrument families are within this organization, and you can sum those to this one track and have the violins right here and cellos right there, and etc., etc. Then you can route all of those to another sum track that's just called orchestra, right? Same thing with the drum set. Like there's a drum set, there's all the microphones. You might have 2 kick drums, right? So I might sum together the 2 kick drums as one track. I might have 2 snare drum tracks, sum those together to one snare drum track, and then route all of those to another drum sum that collects all the drums. So it's like, analogy would be like, here's all this rain coming down on the mountaintop, right? And all the rain trickles down into little gullies, and then those gullies come together and form streams. Then those streams go together and form rivers, and then it all kind of like lets out into the ocean at the end. So it's kind of similar with the signal of audio. You want to slowly bring stuff together, right? And the signals slowly come together into groups that are logical and make sense, and then it all kind of flows out into the stereo output of your headphones or speakers or whatever. Okay, and then along the way I can control individual things, I can control groups of things, subgroups and some sub-sums, and then I can control bigger groups, and then control the entire whole mix. So that's what we're kind of doing here theoretically. That's what you would do with any mix, any collection of instruments. We're just kind of using this as an example, but let's continue that. So I've got the guitars together, I've got the voice together, and I've got the room mics together. Cool. Let's go ahead and bring those 3 things together into what I call a submix. It's just a name for the final kind of point where all the groups of sums of instrument families come together into one track. So the way I would do that is similar process, but I understand that my 3 guitars go into the guitar sum, my 2 voices go into the Vox sum, my 2 rooms go into the room sum. So really the signals I need to collect are from the sums only. So I will do that. I'll hold down Command, select the guitar sum, the Vox sum, and the room sum, because this is where those 3 sounds have been brought together in these main 3 tracks. And I'm going to go to the furthest right one, holding down Option Shift. I'm going to go to the output of that room sum here, and I'm going to choose a new track. I'm going to call this my sub mix and hit OK. And there's a submix that collects the signals from all of these. So if it's done properly and I solo saved it, I'll hear my audio coming out of that submix. Okay, so everything's working good. Cool. So I've collected everything and sent it to this final destination. Now, there is another track that I'm going to use here that's very similar to the submix, but it's not a submix track, it's not an auxiliary input track, it's a master fader. And this is the final fader on your mix. To create a master fader, it's literally just creating a new track. and it's a stereo master fader track. So you can go up to track up here in the tabs, or you can choose to do it with the keyboard shortcut, Command-Shift-N, and then I can change from mono to stereo, and I can change from inputs or audio tracks to master fader. So it's got to be a stereo master fader track. Okay, so one stereo master fader track, hit create, boom, there it is. And then that's kind of the final travel destination of the audio before it's out of the speakers and out of the system. Now the reason I do this is sometimes I will do kind of like in mixing session mastering, and sometimes I'll use reference tracks as a way of gauging my mix, whether I'm in the ballpark of something that's commercial, standard at that level. And really the only way to do it is to literally put a new track into your session that's another, mastered song from, whoever. And I'll use this as a comparison. I'll, put in this new track that has a, as my reference, and I'll mute it and mix, and then I'll solo it and I'll listen to it, and then I'll go back and mute it and I'll listen to my track, and I'll kind of try to balance things. And another thing that's beautiful about having this master fader and the submix is on my submix, all my signals are routed into the submix. So if I want to do a mastering like EQ correction or compression or limiting or something, I can do that on my submix, and it's not going to affect the reference track. So the reference track is going to hit the master fader just like the stuff that's coming out of my submix, which is my mix. So it's also a tool for that as well. So hopefully that makes sense. But reference tracks, always use reference tracks when you're mixing, because it gives you good context of like what's up or down, what's good or bad, what's loud or soft or bassy or not bassy. Like you just need to have another recording to kind of hold yourself accountable with, because you can really trick your ears by turning speakers up louder, having more bass or subwoofers or anything. It's just all a trick. So you got to listen to something that's already tried and true next to your thing and try to balance that so that you're at least in the ballpark. Okay, cool. So we got the submix thing set up. Everything looks good, but the next thing I want to talk about, new subject, let's talk about effects returns and sends. Okay, so the idea here, the principle is that when you put like reverb or delay or chorus or flanger or some sort of like weird effect or non-weird effect on a sound, if you put it directly on the sound, it will muddy up and you'll lose clarity of that original sound. It's like running your guitar through a bunch of pedals. By the time it's coming out of your pedal board and the 5 pedals that it's chained to, the signal has degraded a significant amount. We deal with it, and guitars are always buzzing, sound like crap. But like a really clean guitar through an amp and no pedals, there's like not a lot of buzz and interference. But when you introduce all these devices on top of it, the signal slowly gets degraded, subtly. So same thing can happen with audio effects on a signal chain on a specific track. So you don't want to put reverb directly on your vocal track. It's better to have a clean vocal track that's EQ'd and compressed, and then another track next to it that has reverbed voice on it, so that you can kind of mix to taste and have the clarity of the original track without reverb, and then the sort of reverb thing in parallel. Okay, so that's a return track. It's an effects return track. So it's this track that just has an effect on it, and you send a portion of the signal from all the other tracks into it via a send. So let's do that. So first of all, I want to mention and point out, this is very important, when you're doing a effects return type of track, or something where you only want to send a portion of the signal in duplicate over to this other track, you're going to route from the sends. So over here on your mix, like there's this category of slots here, these are sends. Okay, and we're going to use that. We're not going to use the outputs, because that's the entire signal from that track going somewhere else. It's not a duplicate of it. If we want a duplicate of it, we got to do it from a send, so we can send it in addition to this other location. So we're going to go from there. So I want to do like a reverb. I'll just do one reverb, but I'm going to do it, and I want it to be able to come from any of these tracks except for my submix. I don't want to reverb my submix because my reverbs are going to go into the submix. So basically everything except for the submix in the master fader, I'm going to select all the sum tracks and all the individual tracks. Okay, so once that's selected, I'll hold down Option Shift, and I'm going to go over here to the furthest right side, And I'm going to choose from the first sends category, this little plate here. Just click on the middle. And then new track. Okay. Stereo auxiliary input track. I'm going to call this reverb. And hit create. Boom. Okay. So now there's this new track right next to it before my submix. And also over here there is a new plate, a new send that's labeled reverb that goes across every single one of these tracks. Another thing that you'll see over here is this silly little mixer, track mixer window. So this is basically the volume of one of the sends, probably this one right here. I'm not going to use this as a method of turning up the signal, but this is what that does. This turns the signal up and lets out the signal through the send into the other track. So that's how you get signal from this track, say, right here, into my reverb. See how I turn that up and now there's signal happening on that reverb? Anyway, just X out of that. We're not going to use that. What we're going to do is when we change the levels of the sends, when we want to send portions of the signal into the reverb to get reverb on the voice and guitars and all that kind of stuff, we're going to have one reverb track, and we're going to change the fader of the send from up here. So check this out. Hold down Command and click on the very left side of one of these sends. So see that little arrow right there? If you click on the left corner of that, it exposes a fader, which allows me to change the amount of signal that's leaving any of these individual tracks and traveling into the reverb track. So that's how we're going to add reverb to taste from different instrument tracks into the reverb track. So anyway, once again, I need to solo save that reverb track. Probably need to make it a different color because I don't want it to be mixed up with my sums. So I'm going to make it blue. My submix too, it's the same color as my sums. It's a different functioning thing, so I'm going to change the color of that as well. I want my submix to be red because it's similar to the master fader in functionality. Okay, moving. Okay, cool. So the next thing we're going to do is put a reverb insert on the reverb return track. So right now there's nothing. If I turn up these faders, really just makes the signal louder by sending it into this other track. So what I need to do is go up to the first insert slot up here, click and choose I'm going to choose a multi-channel reverb plugin from this category. And you probably don't have the same plugins that I have. I've got a bunch of them, but if you're doing Pro Tools Basic, you probably have the Deverb as the only option for reverb. And we'll use that one today. So it's under the reverb category in the inserts. Choose Deverb and boom, there's a reverb. Cool. So you can adjust the reverb to be whatever type of reverb you want. You have all these parameters. It can be different rooms and plates and churches and sizes and whatever. So it doesn't quite matter. I'm going to go with a medium hall. It's kind of a generic sound. And I can set it however I see fit. And then I can hit that X up there at the top of the corner and it disappears, but it's always still there. You can see the reverb right there. There it is. Oh, it's back. X out of it. So that's how you can show and hide the actual plugin. And we call these plugins, even though it's inserts, but it's a digital device that's modeling some analog piece of gear like a reverb unit or something. But whatever they are, they show up as little inserts and they're called plugins. Okay, so I can bypass any of these plugins by holding down Command and clicking. That's another nice tool. Is like, okay, let me turn off the reverb or turn off the compressor, whatever it is. Command click on it and it just blues it out, which is canceling it out. All right, cool. So now that I have reverb here, let's see how it works. So I'm going to solo the voice and then turn it up a little bit. If you promise to stay, now we got verb. And I can control how much reverb by turning up the fader on that specific track. Okay, cool. So I might mix to taste reverb on whatever other tracks I have. Maybe the guitar tracks. I kind of solo the guitar tracks. I'm going to pan my guitar, large diaphragm, small diaphragm, stereo setup of mics. I'm going to pan those hard left and right. Maybe leave the DI in the middle, just kind of low. And what I could do, instead of putting reverb up on these things individually, I could turn reverb up on the guitar some. Give it some body. There we go. So another application of reverb and reason for reverb, theoretical reasoning, is reverb makes stuff sound like it's in a space. Okay, so reverb is basically modeling like some sort of spatial environment. Rooms, halls, churches, caves, ways of recreating fake reverb, like with spring reverb or plate reverb or reverb chambers of some sort. So anyway, that's what they used to like synthetically create reverb, by just putting a speaker in a room. That was kind of all hard surfaces, and then putting a mic in it, and then that was like, it sounded like it's in a hallway now. So hey, that's, you just turn that up, and that's the reverb. So now it's all digital and stuff, but it recreates these kind of old school ways of creating fake reverb with digital fake reverb. But reverb happens in a space. It's modeling a spatial environment. So it makes sense to have one reverb or two or three different flavors of reverb that you kind of mix together, and they form like the spatial environment, and you can send portions of each signal into it. Now, more reverb you add on something, the more it sounds like it's far away. So when you're mixing, theoretically, you want to space stuff, put stuff in a three-dimensional space. So left and right, width, you can do things like panning the guitars hard left and right if there's a stereo pair, right? Get the guitars out on the sides of the speakers, and then there's room in the middle for the voice. So you're kind of creating this three-dimensional, width space, and you're also making a depth spatial kind of feeling as well. And the way that you can do that is, like, if something's loud and has no reverb on it, it sounds like it's right in front of your face. If it's kind of soft and has a lot of reverb on it, it sounds like it's far away in the back of the room. So depending on how I want to do this, I might put my voices further back with a lot of reverb, or put my guitars further back from the voice with a lot of reverb, and it might give me the feeling that the guitar's like in the background. Now it sounds like the guitars are kind of like back in the room and the voice is like way up front. So anyway, you're creating this spatial environment and this feeling of depth with reverbs. And you're using panning to kind of get the stereo effects too. So balancing sounds is the next thing I'm going to talk about here. And balancing, mixing sounds together, some of the core principles are, you want to be able to hear everything. Right? I want to hear all the guitars, I want to hear all the basses and all the instruments in the ensemble. I want them to be easy to hear. I don't want to struggle to hear stuff. So, most people think that's just like turning things up, turning things down. Yeah, it's a little bit of that, for sure. But a lot of it is balancing their spatial location so that things are not on top of each other. Like if every track was panned at, center, like every instrument's going to be right in front of itself. Everything's going to be just stacked up in the middle of the speakers. So if you move stuff to the side, you got room in the middle for more things. So if things are kind of spread out and spatially kind of like orientated, in different regions of the stereo spectrum, it's a lot easier to balance those things because they're not on top of each other. Also, you can have frequencies that bunch up and get on top of each other, right? So if the voice has a lot of bass in it and the guitars have a lot of bass in it, and then there's a bass player, we can maybe move some of the bass frequencies off the voice, like, use a filter to remove some of the low end of the voice. That's not really super important. And we can maybe trim a little bit off the guitars, and then we can leave the low end there for the bass, so that there's like bass down low, guitars in the middle, and then the voice is kind of up here in the middle and upper register. So you can kind of carve frequencies out with like high pass or low pass filters and EQ to also make things easier to balance. If frequencies aren't, bunching up and overlapping with similar frequency ranges in different instruments, it's a lot easier to balance stuff and a lot easier to hear stuff. So you don't have to go crazy turning things up and down constantly all day. It's more of just like panning them apart so that they can be heard in the spectrum, and then carving out frequencies that aren't necessarily a core aspect of one instrument, and it gets it out of the way of the other instrument that shines in that mid-range or that low range, and it's a lot easier to balance. So mixing theoretically is really just a lot of that, and then making everything louder so that it sounds like it's on par with every other commercial recording that's turned up all the way to as loud as it can possibly go. So, you know, that's through compression and limiting and mastering as well. So tonal correction with EQs, balancing things dynamically, of course, but using the tools of EQ and panning to kind of make that work and make that easier, and then bringing the entire session up in volume at the end is kind of like the mixing theory and what mixing is as well. Okay, so I think we covered everything other than just mixing. I talked about the theory of it, but you know, more or less I would go into each of these instruments one at a time. I'm not going to do this because it'll make the video way too long. But for instance, like the voice track, I might do some EQing to help the voice track stay out of the way of the guitar. Right? The guitar's got a little bit of bass in it. It's got some high frequencies. His voice is kind of bassy. I'm going to put the EQ7 as the first insert on his voice, and I'm going to use some EQ tools to find frequencies I like and get rid of frequencies I don't like, more or less. So first thing I might do here is go fishing for just frequencies. So I grab any of these notch filters, which is the little kind of parabolic looking shape type of filter, and it's any of these middle ones here. You can also grab the dot up here, but there's a Q which changes the slope, so I can kind of focus that on one area. There's frequency, which scans it back and forth, and then there's gain, which either boosts that frequency or cuts that frequency out. So what I would do is, you know, basically bump one of these little things with a sharp pointy Q and sweep it back and forth and listen to the frequencies.
To keep you in my heart, if you promise to stay just who you are, is to keep you in my heart.
So you hear that frequency right there is really kind of like muddy and boxy. I could probably do without something like that, right? So I might, you know, move that one down. That's around the 200 hertz. I'm gonna grab another one of these filters and do the same thing.
To keep you in my heart.
So that 500, not really a big fan of that. I'm gonna kind of duck some of that out too. Let's find some stuff I like. So a lot of the articulation of a voice.
To keep you in my heart. If you promise.
So there's a lot of like you know, sibilance that's up here in this 8K realm. So I might do little boost of that. So you see how I'm kind of subtle with this. Sometimes I'm a little bit more extreme with getting rid of a frequency in a narrow spectrum, but more or less I'm using these tiny little incisions to boost things I like or remove things I don't like. And I'm gonna do it kind of subtly and not so heavy-handedly, because I don't want to like go crazy, especially right out of the gate. The other thing I want to do is using the high pass or low pass filters. So up here in these two areas here, you have to turn the thing on, but there's a button that says in, and that activates it. Now you can see that thing is actually working now. And I can change the Q, and I can change the frequency, which basically rolls off at a certain slope the low end of the voice.
To keep you in my heart.
So there we go.
If you promise to stay just who you are.
So I'm just taking the edge off the low end. I don't want his voice to sound like bassy, like it's not Barry White here singing, although it's close. But anyway, EQ, I would, you know, use any of these tools to accomplish the goals that I'm intending to accomplish. The other low pass filter is the opposite of the one I used over here, which basically rolls off the low frequencies, allowing the high frequencies to pass. A low pass filter rolls off the high frequencies and allows the low frequencies to pass. Okay, so I can use those at different various degrees of intensity or whatever, and maybe just subtlety, but more or less you're using these tools to shape the tone of the voice. Okay, so the next core ingredient in a mixing tool, and I would do this across every single track and use my logic of like what I want the instruments to sound like, and I would EQ them subtly, and then I'm going to compress them next to kind of get a little bit more punch and bite out of them. So compression, you should watch the other video I just posted on compression. I'll put a link up here. But there's a lot to talk about with that, so I won't get into detail. I'll just kind of apply it here. So I'm going to put a compressor on my voice as well, and I'm going to choose the one that everyone has in Pro Tools, is the BF76, Bomb Factory 76 compressor, which models a analog 1176 compressor, classic compressor. So yeah, I put it up on the voice track, I hit play.
To keep you in my heart.
Nothing's really happening yet. So to engage the compressor, I need to turn the input up, and that's the signal going into the compressor until I start to see this needle move, and that's the needle is showing me gain reduction. You know, you can see it's like 0, 1, 0, 3, or -1, -2, -3, -5, -20. That's how much gain is being reduced. So I want that needle to kind of bounce around the 5 zone.
To keep you in my heart.
There we go. We got a decent amount of compression happening there, and it got louder, much louder.
In my heart.
So I can compensate the loudness gain or give more loudness with this output.
To keep you.
So depending on how much power I want to give this voice, I can turn the output and change the level that's exiting the plugin. Now, as I'm doing that, I'm looking over here at my meters, and I want my meters to be below 5 dB. When I'm mixing, even adding compression, I want to maybe bring stuff up to the ballpark of 10 to 5 dB, but I do not want to go close to unity, because I want to be able to master this, and you know, all the other instruments at the same time together are going to push it up a little bit more too. So I want to stay behind the -5 dB range on all my instrument tracks. So.
To keep you in my heart.
Okay, cool. Now I might play around with the attack and release. I want the needles to swing back, so my release time.
To keep you in my heart.
I want it to come back
If you promise
before.
to stay just who you are.
There we go. Okay. And the attack time also can add a little bit more punch. So a slower attack time, which is it's already set to, will allow the transient to sneak by and give it a little bit more punch. So this is a quick attack.
You in my heart.
I'm going to loosen it up a little bit.
To keep you in my heart.
Okay, and that adds, sorry the dog, that adds a little bit more punch to his articulations, which help it, you know, help you understand what he's saying. Okay, cool. Other than that, I might play with different ratios. This is basically the ratio of compression, whether it's 4 to 1, 8 to 1, 12 to 1, 20 to 1. Basically, it's like if it's 4 to 1, for every decibel, every 4 decibels of gain exceeding the threshold level, it's going to reduce it 1 dB. So not very extreme, but you know, more in the 8 to 12 range can give you like some definitely apparent compression results.
To keep you in my heart.
Okay, cool. So that's kind of the application of compression, and I kind of go through the whole gamut of adding EQ and compression, routing thing, or like spreading things apart, mixing things together, choosing which microphones I want to use and which microphones I don't care for, room sounds, all the things. But I wanted to focus more on this video of just the session setup of this particular thing, and really kind of like talk in detail about more of a theoretical approach to mixing and the ideas of summing, sounds, effects returns, and applying inserts and plugins on those individual tracks, and kind of the session construction that I usually use when mixing. All right, well, thanks for tuning in. Hopefully you found this video helpful. Be sure to hit subscribe and check out the other videos on music production, and happy composing. We'll see you on the next video. All right, cheers.